the OpenAIRE Metadata Validator and how it is used on achieving metadata excellence and compatibility with the OpenAIRE guidelines, and also compliance, how also it will achieve the fair assessment of the metadata records. The outline of my presentation today, first of all, we're going to have an introduction about the OpenAIRE global strategy and the vision, the strategic vision and the commitment that OpenAIRE has for the interoperability guidelines. The second part we will be talking about the OpenAIRE guidelines and how are they going to be streamlined and modernized. We're going to see the current status and the upcoming developments and what's coming next on the next version of the guidelines. And also we're going to see things about the fair enabled guidelines and the fairness according to the mapping of the fair principles and fair elements to the OpenAIRE guidelines. And at the third part, we have the Metadata Validator, which is the tool that validates, assess the metadata quality against the compatibility with the OpenAIRE guidelines, ensuring interoperability and fairness. We're going to see the supported OpenAIRE guidelines of the Metadata Validator, the new tool that is currently under development and will replace the old Metadata Validator. And we're going to have a short demo of the service. So, the OpenAIRE global strategy. The strategic vision of OpenAIRE has the global alignments on the interoperability guidelines as a core ongoing objective. Repositories increasingly need to follow excellent practices as defined by the interoperability guidelines, and they are certified through metadata validation processes and fair assessment tools. These processes and these tools are the tools that achieve and inform the repositories about the quality of their metadata and their compatibility against the interoperability guidelines. The continuous progress in open science mandates and standards shapes the technical development of repositories and the evolution of the repository networks. In OpenAIRE, we are committed to consistently improve the interoperability guidelines in order to align with this evolution and in order to increase our infrastructure capabilities. And we actively contribute to the development of the international alignment and uptake of common standards, of common metadata standards. The OpenAIRE interoperability guidelines are being used in repository communities and networks, not only in Europe, but worldwide. In Europe, we have national aggregators from Spain, with examples from Spain, Portugal, and other countries. We have research infrastructures of research portals for countries such as the Netherlands or Ireland that are based on compatibility improvements. And of course, we have the European Open Science Cloud Interoperability Framework. And internationally, we have regional networks such as La Referencia from Latin America. We have national initiatives of open access repositories, aggregators, or scholarly communication networks, such as aggregators from Canada and Japan, with an example of Gyro from Japan. And the interoperability guidelines are implemented in repository software platforms by default, and we have examples from DSpace, Dataverse, ePrints, and Invenio Research RDM platforms, software platforms. The guidelines play a vital role in OpenAIRE's strategic approach to address the sustainability, openness, and modernization challenges that are faced by scholarly infrastructures. So, what are the OpenAIRE interoperability guidelines? Well, if we want to have a definition, we can say that it is a common metadata framework that is used to exchange the minimum metadata information. It is based on well-documented and standard existing metadata schemas and control vocabularies. As I have already talked about, they are constantly streamlined and modernized to achieve maximum interoperability, and they have been established to support the open access strategy of the European Commission to ensure a full alignment with the EOSC interoperability framework, of course, to meet the requirements of the OpenAIRE infrastructures for the data sources to be integrated into the OpenAIRE infrastructure and into the OpenAIRE graph. And the latest, they ensure that your data is fair and they follow the FAIR principles. The benefits of being compatible with the OpenAIRE guidelines. First of all, you have improved interoperability to meet the latest IT and repository standards. Your content will be more contextualized with links and relationships to other types of research outcomes and entities, more flexible by using different and improved control vocabularies according to the needs from the communities. And of course, it will assist you to embed your content in the research and infrastructure ecosystem, as you will be aligned with open science mandates and standards and support for well-established metadata schemas and namespace abbreviations. The OpenAIRE Interoperability Guidelines are the road to fairness and also the gateway to European Open Science Cloud. By achieving compatibility, you are integrated into the OpenAIRE graph, and therefore, this is your gateway also to EOSC EU node. This is the history of the OpenAIRE Interoperability Guidelines since 2006, where we started with the driver guidelines, and until we reached 2023 with the latest update of the OpenAIRE guidelines for CRIS managers. This is a community. It's more than an OpenAIRE path. As you can see, we have working and constantly improving the OpenAIRE guidelines for more than 20 years. It is a community journey to improve the common practices. And all this work always is done with the assistance and by the community, the needs of the community. The current status of the OpenAIRE guidelines, we have versions, the OpenAIRE guidelines for institutional thematic repositories and publishing platforms. We have the OpenAIRE guidelines for data archives, for CRIS platforms, and for software repositories and other research products. The OpenAIRE guidelines are fair by design, and as they were built many years before the FAIR principles have been developed, the elements of the OpenAIRE guidelines are basically aligned with the FAIR principles. At the beginning of their time, they had already put the focus on elements that can be found today in the FAIR principles. And with the community-based refinement and enhancement of the guidelines over time, we include elements within their descriptions that are consistent with the motivation of fairness. So let's see the existing versions of the OpenAIRE guidelines with a few more details. First of all, we have the OpenAIRE guidelines version 2 for research data. They are based on the DataCite metadata schema. They have been built and used for research data repositories. They have been online for a while now, and the DataCite schema that is used on this version of the OpenAIRE guidelines is obsolete, and we are currently working on updating this version of the OpenAIRE guidelines in order to incorporate them to the latest version of the OpenAIRE guidelines, the version 4. This is a more complex work because apart from the details regarding the schema that we need to update and incorporate to the guidelines version 4, we also need to have a campaign for the research data repositories that we aggregate into the OpenAIRE graph so that they also upgrade their compatibility with the OpenAIRE guidelines. We have the version 3 of the OpenAIRE interoperability guidelines, which are based on the doubling core metadata schema. The OAI set that was used in the old versions of the OpenAIRE guidelines has been renamed from EC_funded resources to OpenAIRE. This version supports open access, also EC funded, European funded, or national and other funded content. We have new elements that have been introduced in this version to indicate alternative identifiers, relations to other publications, references, and relation also to other research products, to datasets and software. And the Horizon Europe funding program has been introduced from the European Commission. And the version 4 of the interoperability guideline, which is the latest version, the metadata schema is based on doubling core, on elements from doubling core datasite, and the new OAI metadata prefix that we used for a few elements in order to enrich the information, the attributes, and the values that we require in the element and in the attributes that were not covered from the metadata schemas of doubling core or datasite. There is support for identifier schemes for authors, organizations, funders, scholarly resources. We have introduced the core control vocabularies in this version of the OpenAIRE guidelines, and it also supports open and closed content according to the OpenAIRE content acquisition policy. We also have the CRIS guidelines, which are based on the serif metadata schema, which is a standard for information interchange between individual CRIS systems and supported by EuroCRIS. The latest version of the CRIS guidelines is version 1.2 since June 2023. And we have also a publication with the compliance of the OpenAIRE guidelines for CRIS managers with the FAIR principles. A slide regarding the changes and implication between the guidelines versions. We have already discussed about it. I will not stay too much in this slide because we have seen the individual details for the guidelines. The core control vocabularies. We have introduced these vocabularies for the OpenAIRE guidelines version 4. Specifically, there are two types of vocabularies, the core control vocabulary for the resource type and the core control vocabulary for access rights. And we are also going to update the version 3 of the OpenAIRE guidelines so that we also incorporate the core control vocabularies for the resource types and access rights also there. This is a structural update that we have under preparation for the OpenAIRE guidelines. Our goal is to have 3 types of OpenAIRE guidelines: the OpenAIRE interoperability guidelines for repositories, where we are going to incorporate all the guidelines that we have for data archives, software, and other research products. The OpenAIRE interoperability guidelines for CRIS systems, and also the OpenAIRE interoperability guidelines for open access journals, which this is going to be a new instance. Of course, we want to upgrade all our schemas to the latest version of the supported metadata schemas from datasite and doubling core, and also to upgrade the core control vocabularies integration. So this introduction and the description of for the OpenAIRE guidelines. I did it because the metadata validator is based on the OpenAIRE guidelines, and its purpose, of existence, is to validate the metadata of research products for the compatibility with the OpenAIRE guidelines, and also to perform a fair assessment to the metadata of the research products based on fair rules that are mapped to the respective version of the OpenAIRE guidelines. We are going to talk a little bit with more details in the next slides, and we're going also to see the demo. Why it matters, why use the metadata validator? As we already said, you need to achieve compatibility with the OpenAIRE guidelines in order to be integrated into the OpenAIRE graph. And the metadata validator gives you information, detailed information, regarding this compatibility. You can see the number of records that have passed the compatibility for each element of the version of the OpenAIRE guidelines you assess. You get a detailed report about the warnings and the errors for the records that could not manage to pass the compatibility. And you are also going to have in the next version proposals on how to correct or edit these elements in order to achieve the compatibility. This way, by being integrated into the OpenAIRE graph and to the OpenAIRE ecosystems, you get better discoverability and reuse. The interoperability is a standard that is achieved with the compatibility with the OpenAIRE guidelines. And of course, you get to have compliance with international open science standards. So, the OpenAIRE Metadata Validator workflows. Currently, the OpenAIRE Metadata Validator is available through the OpenAIRE Provide dashboard. It's integrated into OpenAIRE Provide dashboard. Therefore, you can use it only if you have an account in OpenAIRE Provide, or you have an account in OpenAIRE Provide and you also have a registered repository, a registered data source in OpenAIRE Provide dashboard. The new version of the OpenAIRE Metadata Validator will be offered also as a standalone service, where you will be able to use it outside of the OpenAIRE Provide dashboard as a standalone service. And this is the service that we're going to see a short demo, the development version of this service. And of course, we are also going to have the continuous validator, which is going to be, it's a service that is going to be integrated into the aggregation of the data sources, into the aggregation process of the data sources for the integration into the OpenAIRE graph. This way, the data sources are going to have a live, let's say a live information about the compatibility with the OpenAIRE guidelines for every aggregation that is happening on a weekly, monthly basis into the OpenAIRE graph. The supported OpenAIRE guidelines for the new version of the OpenAIRE validator, metadata validator. For publications, we have OpenAIRE version 3 and OpenAIRE version 4. For research data, we have the OpenAIRE version 2, which is going to be a legacy version, and this is going to be incorporated to the OpenAIRE guidelines version 4, alongside also, apart from research data, also for software and other research products. And also we are going to have the validation of CRIS systems, of CRIS platforms, based on the OpenAIRE CRIS guidelines. So regarding the fair assessment at the metadata validator, we worked on the fair rules that we used and worked for the FAIR assessment are based on two versions. The first version was based on the FAIR maturity model with the specification and guidelines of the Research Data Alliance, and to the first FAIR data object assessment metrics. And we also have a new incorporation that we are currently implemented, and it comes from the OS Trails project, where we use the FAIR rules, the FAIR dimensions that are based on the GoFAIR rules. There are some slight differences. These FAIR rules are mapped and validated against the OpenAIRE guidelines. To be more detailed, for each FAIR rule, we have a mapping to one or more OpenAIRE guidelines in order to achieve compatibility with the specific FAIR rule. I have in the next slides, I have details regarding this mapping in order to understand it better. The FAIR assessment will be able to be run independently and also in combination with the validation against the OpenAIRE guidelines. So in this table, I have put the mapping to the OpenAIRE Guidelines version 4 for the FAIR principles from the GoFAIR rules, the mapping from the GoFAIR rules to the OpenAIRE Guidelines version 4 elements. As you will see, for example, for the FAIR principle of metadata are assigned a globally unique and persistent identifier. We have the datasite identifier element from the OpenAIRE guidelines that must be populated correctly so as we are going to have a successful FAIR assessment for this FAIR principle. There are also FAIR principles, such as the next one, which are based, the mapping is based on several fields from the OpenAIRE guidelines. For example, the data are described with rich metadata. FAIR principle is mapped to multiple elements from the OpenAIRE guidelines, from the creator, title, publisher, date, description, and subject. Respectively, also for the next principle, we have several metadata elements, and we also have, for some FAIR principles, in order to achieve the successful FAIR assessment, the resource needs to be validated entirely against the OpenAIRE guidelines, meaning that we need to have a successful validation for the entire OpenAIRE guidelines, and not only for one specific rule. For example, the metadata are registered or indexed in a searchable resource requires that this data source should be validated against the OpenAIRE guidelines. I have put the whole table from the GoFAIR principles with the mapping to the OpenAIRE guidelines. One thing that I would like to mention here is for the validation against the OpenAIRE guidelines and the FAIR assessment in the FAIR individual, in the OpenAIRE guidelines individual rules, there is a difference that, for example, in the validation against the OpenAIRE guidelines, there may be fields that are recommended or optional, but at the mapping with the FAIR principles, these fields become mandatory so as to achieve the successful FAIR assessment. So apart from the mapping, we also have differences in the cardinality of the OpenAIRE guidelines rules and their attributes. So the user interface, the features of the user interface, we're going to have validation option selection. We will provide interactive reports on the warnings, errors, and also suggestions on how to achieve compatibility or how to improve the fairness. These are going to be offered with pop-up windows with details for these warning errors and errors for each individual validated rule. The user interface is designed for usability by repository managers, librarians, metadata experts, and developers. And of course, when we are going to have this service online soon, we are also going to ask for feedback from the community, from you, in order to improve elements in the user interface. So the OpenAIRE Metadata Validator input. What can someone give as an input to be validated? First of all, we have the OAI-PMH input method. Currently, we have the option to validate a single record, either via its URL at the OAI-PMH endpoint or the entire XML that you can paste it in a text box. And you can also have the set-based or select the entire OAI-PMH endpoint to be validated. And this is the current input method that is also offered in the current metadata validator that is incorporated into OpenAIRE Provide. We also have on our plans to validate, to have the option to perform validation, fair validation via PIDs, via DOIs and handles on a single research output. And for the fair assessment, we will also incorporate the API option that is based at the input that will be compatible with the fair if metadata schema from OS Trails. The supported metadata format. Currently, we support XML, and we have planned to also support the JSON LD and DCAT metadata schemas. Regarding the output, the reports of the metadata validator will include compatibility status, cardinality checks, linked with the FAIR principles, the counts of success fails and failures, and all these will be exportable. Especially the error and the warnings will be exportable as an option to get the logs for the user. And of course, we are also going to have an API-based output, which will follow the format of the fair if metadata schema from OS Trails. Test options and API integration for the fair assessment. You will be able to run specific fair tests through the user interface by selecting the respective guidelines for the OpenAIRE Guidelines validation, or by selecting fair rules for the fair assessment. And also all this will be also available via API so as to be compatible with the OS Trails requirements. And this way we're going also to support modular validation scenarios. And also regarding the continuous validator, as I have already mentioned, this is a lightweight version that will be integrated into the aggregation workflows for the incorporation to OpenAIRE Graph, so as to provide continuous validation of the compatibility for the aggregated data sources. By continuous validation, as I have already mentioned, this will happen for each aggregation of the data source. This way, we will be able to discover any issues that might arise regarding the validation or the compatibility and inform, respectively, the repository, the data source managers. The continuous validator follows a decoupled logic for scalable background validation. It's used in live data in JSON and ensures metadata readiness for the aggregation into the OpenAIRE graph. And by this, let us go through a short demo of the standalone version that we are currently developing. So for the standalone version, you will see the options where we can have a single record validation, where we can give the URL of a record into an OAI PMH endpoint from a data source. Then we can select the guidelines that we want to use for the FAIR assessment. This version is currently working only for the FAIR assessment, that it is not applicable for the compatibility with the OpenAIRE guidelines, such as there we want to achieve on a data source level mostly than on an individual record. By selecting the guidelines, I'm not going to run this single record test because it's not currently working well, but I want to present you the options. By selecting the FAIR guidelines that we will use, you can also define the rules that you want to validate for the FAIR assessment. We also have a single record version where you can paste the entire XML of the metadata of a single record. And here we have the option to give the OAI-PMH base URL of a data source to validate. You give the URL, you can select the guidelines that you want to use, the validator to use to perform the validation and also the FAIR assessment. You can select the individual guidelines, or you can also select the guidelines in combination with the FAIR assessment. For this case, we are going to use the version 4 of the OpenAIRE guidelines and the FAIR assessment for the FAIR guidelines for the version 4, because this repository is compatible with this version of the guidelines. And you can also define the number of records to validate. For the development version, we have set it from 10 to 100 only, but it will be available. Also, you can also select the entire range of your metadata records. And of course, you can select specific set from your repository, your data source, to be validated. Let's give it a few seconds to perform the validation of these 50 records. Okay, since it's taking more than expected, I have also prepared a validation of the same repository just before the presentation. So in order to save time, let me go through that validation, where I have performed the validation for 10 records from that repository. The specific repository, though it is compliant with the version 4 of the OpenAIRE guidelines, it has basically research data and software, because we're going to upgrade the OpenAIRE guidelines for research data, and this is a new data source. We followed and added them to be compatible with the latest version of the OpenAIRE guidelines. So in the first tab, we have the results with the validation against the compatibility with the OpenAIRE guidelines. For each rule from the OpenAIRE guidelines, we have, first of all, we have the first principles that this rule can be mapped. The first principles meaning the findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. We have the success rate, the number of records that passed the validation. We have the status and any issues regarding warnings and errors that might have been found. Let me go through, for example, let's go to the creator, where we have some warnings. Again, I need to tell you that this is a development version and we are currently working on several aspects, and one of them is to have a more user-friendly output regarding the logs. Here in the warning list, we have a warning which specifically says that the recommended attribute, the datasite affiliation for the datasite creator element, does not exist in the datasite creator. Since it is a recommended rule, we show it as a warning. We are currently under discussion so as to see if we will or we will not incorporate it as a warning, because since it is recommended and it is not populated, it doesn't bring any error or any issue with the aggregation. And for every warning and error, we have an indicative list of records from the OAI PMH endpoint, where you can see directly the metadata for this research output and pinpoint the issue that it is described. For example, in the datasite creator, you can see that in all the fields, the datasite affiliation element is not present. And let me go through the second tab, where we have the fair assessment. We have the list of its fair rule, the mapping to the fair principles, the success rate, also the status, and the issues with the warnings and errors. For example, let's go through the first one, with the data are described with rich metadata. We have some warnings regarding the subject, description, and creator element. These are also things that we want to have them more user-friendly and also adjust all the warnings and errors to be understandable by the user. For the metadata assigned the global unique and persistent identifier, we don't have any issues here for this fair rule. And respectively, you can all see all this information for all the fair principles. And one more work we need to do here is to have a column with a mapping for each rule to the respective OpenAIRE guidelines, such as the ones that I have provided you in my PowerPoint presentation. So with this, I think I am done. Thank you very much for your attention and for your time.
So thank you, Leonidas, for this presentation, and that presented the Metadata Validator and the dual role with the OpenAIRE guidelines and the fair assessment. And the short demo, actually I didn't ever before say how you can validate your data through the Metadata Validator. So it was very interesting. Yes, so if anyone had have a question, you can write to the chat or you can raise your hand. All and the presentation and the recording will be published. The recording will be published in OpenAIRE's YouTube channel, and the presentation will be published in Zenodo, and we will send you the link. So we have a question in the chat. If you can say, Leonida, the chat, or I can tell the question. Do you have any idea when this will be in production?
Our plan is to be as soon as possible. By the end of the summer, we will go have a more concrete idea regarding when. Our goal is to have it ready before, at least the most of the functionalities, to have them ready before the end of the year.
Thank you, Leonida. Okay. Will the code be open source?
Yes, of course. All the code from all our services and platform is available as open source.
Leonida, you can see the chat.
Mhm.
Yeah, perfect.
We have XML schema and XSD examples in GitHub and also in the publications in Zenodo regarding the OpenAIRE guidelines. And yes, Tom, this is our goal to currently to have the messages, especially with the continuous validator, to have the validator as an important part of the workflow. Currently, the validator in OpenAIRE Provide is used mostly for informative purposes for the data sources to see how compatible they are.
Since I don't see any other questions, Leonidas, if you have to mention something extra, and then we can close the session.
If anyone needs any further information regarding the process and how everything is going, you are free to contact us, my mail, to the help desk, and we will be happy to assist you in any part of the process.
So you can see.
There exists, let me see in the last one, large long-term databases. Okay, so regarding the fair assessment, we are also going to offer the option to assess a research product via its PID, its DOI or handle. Regarding an entire data source, the fair assessment at this phase is connected with the compatibility of the OpenAIRE guidelines. There are large long-term databases that they have their own standards, and there are databases, especially the protein data bank. We aggregate the protein data bank into the OpenAIRE graph. It's an instrumental data source, meaning they do not have to achieve compatibility with the OpenAIRE guidelines. And since our fair assessment regarding the data source level is based on the mapping with the OpenAIRE guidelines, therefore, at the risk data source level, you cannot use the validator, but you will be able to use it at the research product level.
So thank you, Leonidas, and for the presentation and for answering the question. So if there is no other questions for Leonidas, thank you all for participating in this training session. If you have anything else to ask, you can contact us through our help desk and Leonidas, by Leonidas' email. So thank you all, and have a nice rest of the day. Thank you, Leonidas.
Very much.